every day. Time no day, so every day. If you see what happened today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Home Notes. My name is Oluwashayo Olowoake, and I'm your host. And today I'm joined by three guests. I'm going to go in the order of my screen. So, Emmanuel Nwogbo, Mr. Keazor, and Mr. Libsekal. And what my guests have in common is that they were all contributors to the Mark Makers exhibition at ArtX 2024. So, welcome everyone. And then
Good afternoon.
I'm just going to get everyone to introduce themselves and just say briefly the role they played for the exhibition. What should we start with? Mr. Kizo, should we start with you?
Well, thank you. Yes, I was consultant historian and archivist, for the exhibition, and obviously supporting the curators, the co-curators on the project. So yeah, that was my role essentially.
Amazing. Okay, Miss La, should we go to you next?
Um, Morning, everyone. My role was coming up with the concept and then co-curating it together with Fikayo Adebajo.
Okay. And then Emmanuel.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I was the graphic designer slash also made the design exhibition scenography.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for those introductions. So I'm just going to go back to Missla. I actually was very happy that I got to see the show last year. But just to give context to the viewers and also to foreground this conversation, can you just speak about the content of the show and then why this was the curatorial choice for you and your co-curators?
The show Mark Makers was about Nigerian role models, and the idea really came from the theme, the Promised Lands, which was a way to think about the current context in Nigeria and also seeding this question of where are we going, which obviously is a pretty large question, but we wanted to make it in let's say a generative way, because the idea of the Promised Lands, really talks about this idea of a place where one is eagerly seeking to go and which one expects will greatly improve their situation. And when we were thinking about that idea, we realized that having role models would be something very important for that, which was how we came onto the idea of thinking about role models. And through my research, I came back to Ed Keazor, who I've had a chance to collaborate with. And so that's what really sparked the idea of the Mark Makers. So in terms of content, what we were looking at was finding role models, individuals who've made significant contributions within their time, but are just less known or less discussed in the contemporary. And we wanted to really be quite generous in terms of how we were thinking about representation. Really thinking, coming from an inclusive and a social justice kind of point of view. So whether it's like gender, religion, age, field, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Well, that's great. When I think of the notions of promised lands, going to role models is not always like the next thing that I think of. So that was like this is actually very interesting to hear. But yeah, I'll go to Mr. Kizo. When Mr. told me that this came from your archive, I started to think just how much work and time that it must have taken to document. My question is, how did this start for you? At what point did you decide that these stories were important to actually start noting? And do you know any of these people through mutual connections?
A very good question. It's quite interesting that about 12 years ago, at the first inaugural social media week, my presentation was on the 30 greatest Nigerians we never knew. And that's by the year after, the idea formed itself into a book, the 120 great Nigerians we never knew. And now the inspiration for that, to answer your question, was that the promised lands concept had always been at the back of my mind, throughout the course of my research. Because for me, it was like, look, this is a country that gets lots of bad press, or a continent that gets past a lot of bad press, You know what I mean? And I thought, well, there are gems of inspiration, because the reality is that is the country hungry for leaders, hungry for role models, hungry for heroes to use, and heroines, to use the word in the most appropriate form. And so that was what spawned the great Nigerians. And then they obviously, as an historian, you want to go for the less trodden path, and that's why I chose the ones you never knew. And then Missla approached me and to say, "Look, is this your book?" I said, "Yes." And then then she explained what the thinking was behind the concept, and I was very much, very absolutely loved it, because that's what we want. So those are the stories that we need. To get to the promised land, you need guides. And guides are those who provide at least the idealist concept of the idealist direction. And so it wasn't very, very difficult. And obviously this is what I do. This is I won't use the word bread and butter, because it goes beyond just a livelihood. This is what I do by way of for interest, for inspiration. And I've done this now for over 30 something years. I've been gathering these figures for 30 something years. So it was really a combination of what was needed to compress into the curatorial vision that Missla and Fikayo had. And the result of that collaboration is what you see. And I must pay tribute to the two ladies and to Emmanuel, because we speak about it now from a distance, but the amount of work that they had to do, my work was far less this time than the last time, was far less, but the amount of work they had to do to convert that concept, which sounds good when you're talking about it, but the actual muscular work of turning it into a physical installation, it was phenomenal, a phenomenal effort. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And I guess that just kind of goes back to what Mr. was saying about the role models, the promised lands, the idea of needing guides. That's why I said I'd never thought about this before. That obviously, like when people do like make this
It's true.
trip, they kind of just go kind of blind in a sense. But I think I'll come back to the stories, and I just want to go to Emmanuel first. Emmanuel, before I ask you about a story that you found fascinating, I'm very interested in your art practice of history telling through collage and collaging. And my question is, why this medium for you? Because when you think of collage, you know, these, what you choose, or what objects you choose to go on the final product can either reveal or conceal, tell aspects of a story or not tell aspects of a story. So I'm just interested for you, why this medium?
Oh, thanks, Sayo. Um, I think it started from just me liking Photoshop and playing around in Photoshop. So this was around 2010, 2011. I just started messing around with Photoshop. And then when I got to school, I studied graphic design, and I realized that I liked a lot of the history that
Mm-hmm.
had to do with, design, and then a lot of Nigerian history. And being a Nigerian artist, I just everywhere I go here in Canada, I'm pretty much the only like black person. So it's almost like you have to represent automatically. So that's kind of how it started. So I started. I started. The first thing I did was it was James Bond, because I love James Bond. So I did a lot of James Bond art, and so then I realized that all I was doing was very like almost like foreign. Like I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't doing anything like home based. So I decided, okay, I want to start doing things that are Nigerian, African, and so that's kind of how it came about. And me personally, I've always liked or preferred people that were less known. So that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of how I met Missla, because I was working on something with for Princess Elizabeth Olowo, the first female bronze maker in Nigeria. So I like finding people like that. So every Black History Month or Women's History Month, I try to find like really obscure people that. So that's how Missla found me in the first place. So I don't know if I answered the question. So
That
that's
it
how it came about.
definitely does.
Yeah.
Definitely does. I'm just realizing how much this is like a beautiful match. Three of you finding each other and like working together. And so Emmanuel, let me just ask you again, what story did you find fascinating while you were working on this
Ooh,
exhibition?
we had so many so many figures, but I did like I think Aliu Jilani. That's the one that I found really really
Mm.
fascinating. Like he's a very interesting guy. I read some articles about him, and Yeah, so that was the one that really really touched me the most.
Okay, that's cool. Um, Mr. Keazor, if I could go back to you, actually, I wanted to ask about Chinyere Asika and August Agbola Brown. I was wondering if you could tell me more about them and how you came into their own stories.
I was commissioned to work on a biography of her husband. And as a tangent, as an historian, what you do is you explore the subject, in all its concentric circles. And as she was talking about her own life, what she was doing when she was with him, because we're focused on him, I was like, to use a Nigerian colloquial phrase, but your story is very important now.
Mm.
This is huge, for me, and I have a great deal of interest, and I focus in my research on women's, women's achievements. You know what I mean? Because obviously, my focus is on those who deserve to be heard but are not heard enough. So hearing of this powerful female story, for me, a feminist, character with the first female computer science graduate, not just in Nigeria, but actually in Africa, and then, her work with women. And then, when she told me quite a few stories, that many that we didn't actually get to put, obviously, the limitations of space and, and so on and so forth. I was like, no, your story needs to be told aside of. So I actually wrote her biography, which is also available online. So it was easy to translate that narrative into the 120 Great Nigerians book. And I did not have to worry about anybody saying, oh, but you already know her, so isn't that cheating? I was like, well, it's because I know her that I can write about it, and you can't
Mm.
read her story and not be inspired by it, so I have no apologies for that. So
Mm.
that was a Chinyere Asika story in how, in terms of how I came across it and how it inspired me. As for Agbola Brown, now I came across him in a research group. We have a small research group, and his name came up, and I dug deeper into it, and I was amazed at how important it was. And my research into him was published online, and it's quite interesting that the most comprehensive research on Agbola Brown, before mine or apart from mine, was done by an American professor, an American historian, and American and Polish duo, and they referenced my work extensively. That was pretty much like a trigger for theirs. So I knew a lot about him, from gathering from various sources, and in fact, we found a video of him, not just him in film, which was actually part of the installation, I believe, Missla, and on the event. So it was purely by chance that I came across this story. But then you know how it is when you latch onto something like a shark, you dig deeper until you actually find a lot more information. That's what historians do, and I was really inspired by it because for me, there are many strands of relevance that come out of this. One, you're talking about people who are seen, who do not get their just assessment or just just assessment in the broad international sphere. And here was a man who was in Poland, and Poland has a very racist right wing a streak to it, and Eastern Europe in general. But here was a man who turn that on its head. And apart from that, the story of the Polish resistance is sheathed in romance. And so I thought, look, you've got this guy who is in the middle of this, and nobody seemed to know about it. So I managed to, and I need to point out that I might also gathered further material towards a film that was meant to be coming out, but obviously that's still in the abyss. But there was a lot to be proud of, and because he was also here in London, the same city that I live in, that he was buried, he had a significance and resonance for me. So yeah, that was the inspiration behind those two stories. And I knew Chinua Achebe very well. I didn't know Gosawella Brown, but I might as well have known him by the time we were done. Thank you.
Mm. Yeah. I was walking through the exhibition, looking at everything. I was thinking to myself, I do not know half or quarter of these stories or who these people are. And I think just hearing about them, and a part of me wants to say, "Oh, tell me more." Miss La, can I ask you as well about the stories that you found fascinating working on this? Maybe one or two stories you want to share with people.
You know, to be honest, I think it's very difficult to choose one because like every single figure is just really remarkable. And for me, I think the thing that was also really profound was understanding that each individual faced adversity in their time, but
Mm.
despite that, persevered and made a mark. Um, I, I I loved Victoria Uremi, who was the first guitarist, first female guitarist.
Mhm.
And I remember when Ed shared that story, he really pointed out to us how she was dressed. And I think this was in the 1950s. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ed. In the 1950s, and she was dressed like a man. Wearing pants and a hat. And for me, somebody who grew up with Grace Jones, who really loved how Grace Jones was really really challenging this idea of representation. I could easily make that connection. And when we did the talk with Ed, I actually was wearing Ethiopian Eritrean clothing, but actually for a man, not a woman. Not that people would recognize it. So that was kind of my nod to her. But also, maybe I could also speak about Chinyere. Chinyere mobilized over 1 million women. And I think Ed can speak more to that. But when I think about that in the 60s, and there's not a moment of, it's not a time of social media, you just think about how to get 1 million people to move in the same direction. That seems like quite a formidable task, or even to accomplish, which I think is so incredible in terms of helping people mobilize to reestablish themselves after coming out of the Biafran War.
Yeah. Ed, can you actually just speak a bit more to Chinyere Asika's the event Mr. just mentioned about her mobilizing um 1,000 women?
No.
A million.
1 million. Whoops,
Yes.
sorry.
Yes.
1 million
Yes.
women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you just speak to more about her and who?
Okay. Let me start by saying that Chinyere was very steeped in the traditional historical role of women in Igbo society. Very steeped in it. Her father was a polygamist, but he was actually an educationist, a very well-educated man, but a polygamist. But then you see the notion of polygamy as being just women are suffering. They have basically the women, his wives, were far wealthier than him. And in fact, at one stage, his wives were basically running the home. You know what I mean? But he was still revered as the husband. He had three wives. So I just want to give a bit of context to how her approaches to organization and women and organization of women, which is what became her forte. Now, in the aftermath of the war, right? In the aftermath of the war, uh, let me use a phrase that was in the book we wrote for her. 7 million citizens of the state were in need of succor. It was basically, if you know anything about the Nigerian Biafra war, total devastation across the east, hunger, deprivation everywhere. She told me about how one of the first things she did was, as in the war ended and people were streaming back to Enugu, the capital of the East Central State, which is basically the former capital of Biafra. She mobilized at least 100 women and they started cooking in various locations around Enugu and just feeding people. And nobody would ask you where did the food come from. People needed food. People who hadn't eaten proper meals for days, they fed people. Now, when her husband and had a concept of Oluobodo, that's the community work, and by his concept, because an economist and an economist and a political scientist, he said there's a difference between Oluoyibo, which is white man's work, and Oluobodo, community work. Community work, there's a sense of ownership to community work for indigenous African people, in the same way they do not have that sense of ownership to Oluoyibo, the white man's work. So that people are less likely to, if you could leave me with £1 million of community money and not a dime will go missing. But if you leave me in an office with £500, £5 might £5 might go missing because it's white man's money. There's no sense of ownership. So the traditional women's organizational models were what she used to set up a cadre called Utuolu Ubudo, which means the guild of community work. And it was a women's focused guild in which the women came together and there were donations were given from private sources, from private corporate institutions. Basically, they were bullied into donating to the formation of this guild, because they needed seed money. And the women were told, go and farm. As you farm, you're feeding the family. Go and trade. Here's money. Basically organized them in, there was a mobilized force of women. And the thing is, at that time, people were very open to such positive ideas, because if you said to them, look, this is what you need, that because Igbos in particular are very individualistic, and also they have that sense of endeavor. So you're telling them, look, you help yourself, don't sit down waiting for handouts, and this is how you do it. Organize farming guilds, organize trading guilds. Here's some seed money to do this. The government brought some money, and then a lot of corporate institutions and donors brought some money. And so before you know it, it spread like wildfire, almost like the About Women's War, which I also referenced in the book, in the sense that they were told something positive is happening, mobilization, agency, individual effort, endeavor, all the traditional values of the Igbos, and in particular of Igbo women, because I'm very, very intentional about the fact that Igbo women had a great deal of agency. And so that's why, and the thing is, all they needed was an overarching driving force for this. And Curator-at-Large was at the apex of it. And it thus happens that, unfortunately, the change of government in July 1975 meant that the formal launch, which took place about in May, a lot of the programs that were meant to push forward did not happen. And between you and I mean, I can say this openly. After Chinere left office, Otuolubodo died a natural death, because oil boom was now in place. People stopped worrying about, organizational guilds. It's just more about, okay, where's the next subvention coming from? And people stopped trying. And I don't say this just because I'm a fan of ours, which I am, but it's just a fact of life that it died a natural death. And this is a women's group that could have been a positive springboard for greater feats of development did not happen. But it so happens that even after, when the civilian government came back in, she still had that network of women, which is why she became the women's leader of the National Party of Nigeria, and she drove the efforts that ensured victory for her party, driven by the women in 1983. So yeah, that's a bit of a story about how she went about what she did.
It's so important to hear stories like this, um, and to just know, you know, being in society, or you hear people say, oh, women were not really prominent here, or somehow it gets erased. But you hear one woman's story like this, and then the countless other women that she had to mobilize, or she mobilized through this, and the programs that were about to start, and the things that were happening. Um, as someone who obviously was not living at that time, you think this is where we could have been. I feel like it helps retrace our steps. Also helps us to think through, I guess, what is missing now, and what other things can we begin to do as a society that actually champion like change like this. So I don't know. I love hearing the stories, and I'm just sitting down taking it all in. Um, but yeah, that's why I've been really thinking about archives and preserving history, and what it means, and what the archive could mean for how we view our society now, and how we approach or engage with our, at least our city, or our education, or how that like trickles into different sectors of life. But to go back to the exhibition, um you have this archive, and you can choose whether you do a catalog, or like a series of talks, or like an exhibition. How do you go about translating this to an exhibition? I know we're just talking about, I asked Emmanuel about same thing with collage. You have these objects that you place in the center, and it it changes, or it reveals or conceals what gets told. And so how do you navigate that in putting this exhibition together, um taking this archive, and then bringing it to this exhibition? I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that question.
Well, I mean, I think there's always editing choices, and also just like hearing, for example, Ed talking about the complexity of these stories. You feel like something positive about being able to make an exhibition, but also feel something painful because you can't tell everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, like the point really is like to place a seed. Actually, maybe that's the most important.
Yes.
Because if I think about just what you just said before about how it's starting to seed questions for you, then I think we've done our job, because
Mm-hmm.
each person has to seek their own path, right? But in order to kind of have a sense of direction, it helps to know that something came before you. And for me, when I think about, for example, the idea of Sankofa, which it's the idea of, you have to look back to be able to go forward. That's really why I think archives become very important. And, in the contemporary sense, I would say that a lot of artists of African ancestry, whether they be on the continent or in the diaspora, are constantly trying to respond to their contemporary, and they're, in order to navigate or deal with their contemporary, which oftentimes is very complex. They're dealing with issues like memory, trauma, like governance, all kinds of things that we don't necessarily think can be addressed through aesthetics. But actually, that's where the archive becomes really, really important, because through that, then they start to have a much more complex understanding of the things that they're trying to engage with, to then formulate into like an aesthetic response.
Yeah, that's good. Well, planting a seed. Mr. Keazor, do you have any thoughts about that? Just translating this archive to exhibition, maybe what it means for the city.
Well, let me. As I said, I want to throw the credit back to the curators and the designer. It was that really was where the compression, like, yeah, you were like, it was where the compression, the artistic and intelligent compression of all that data occurred. And I will actually echo Misla's comments about the pay. It was for me at times it was actually painful to see what we could not get in. And I had all these highfalutin ideas, and so did Missla, and so I'm sure so did Emmanuel and Fikayo. But you ask yourself, well, we can't do that. We can't get it in there. And all you could hope for is that someone says, yeah, as I always say, when I make films, because I make films, when I make films, I thought, well, look, I've done my own. Oh yeah, pick the baton up and expand on it. And that's what we hoped to do, to start a conversation. And one thing I will say, which is going off script a little, one of the hopes I had, and when we were ideating on this, and obviously when we're dealing with contracts, ambits, and so on and so forth, what I can reveal is that we'd hoped that this thing could travel. But then look, wishes were horses. The practicalities of that are hard without funding and so on and so forth. And it's a tough one, but I still hope and pray that a miracle happens and this exhibition can actually travel, because so much work was done on it, so much incredible talent in the curation and design and and installation. So I really think it ought to travel. I really think it ought to be seen, even if it's just a 360, even if it's just a recording of it traveling. I really think it ought to be seen for the value. Yes, one should not be judging one's own exam paper, but I will say it was a beautiful work, visually and otherwise, and I really hope it can be seen more widely. So that's why this podcast, for me, in a sense, was important, and in happening. And thank you for thinking of it.
No problem at all. I think when I finished going around this exhibition, I was like, is there a catalog? I will buy a catalog. Like, is there something I can keep? I just have everybody's names and what people have so far, so that if I ever want to even research more, I'll go straight into that, or just any document. I know Mr. Akizo now. I know I have the link to your 120 great Nigerians. I've kept it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be going back to go from here. But you're right in hoping for a miracle, and I'm hoping for the miracle with you, that this
Absolutely.
has some kind of life. But are there other, I know you talked about the film, which is still kind of in the abyss, but are there any other sort of plans to make any of these stories independently, um in public domain, like in some form, some art medium or form?
Oh, let me say that the films are the only things I can control. At the moment, I was in talks with my former, well, my client, he's still my client, Moabudu, about mining stories from this for film. But that's for feature films. That's not happened. We're looking at AI generated products, for this educational tools. We've been talking about that at Ibaje, which is a resource center I head. So these are the things that are there in the PAM. These are the things I can talk about. There are others, but the thing is, a lot of these things haven't actually seen the light of day because, which is one of the reasons why I was very, very, honored that Missla in particular have identified this as a concept that could be injected into the mold of ArtX, 2024 and the Promised Land narrative, because a lot of people do not know what to do with the information. They are inspired by the stories, like, okay, what do we do with it? How do we translate this thing into a visual format, at least a visual product that can be appreciated by people? And that's why I will keep praising them for having the gravitas to get this done. So aside from what they've done, nothing has yet, apart from maybe a couple of film projects that are still waiting to get into production. Nothing has been. Well, as a further book, I mean, I need to point out there's a second edition of the book coming out soon. It's been commissioned, but otherwise nothing else.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm happy to hear about the second book, and hopefully more people, maybe from listening to this and digging deeper, to get inspired to take the baton on, and just delve deeper into the world of research and making these great Nigerians known even further to inspire our generation to do more. Um, I've come to the end of my questions. I thought honestly that I'll have more and I'll have a lot to say, but thank you so much for your time, and just thank you for sharing this with me. And yeah, for the viewers, look out for the next episode, but also you can find everybody's links to everything that they do will be in the description box. So feel free to go and look at those projects and look at those names and see what you can carry on as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Fikayo.
Thank you.
Them no say we day, we come night and day. Sister pave the way, so I no hesitate. Brother tell me say, make I no come exclaim. Cause this gist it day, yes this gist it day.